There are moments in life when someone drifts away, not with a storm, not with a final word, but with the quiet certainty of a tide pulling back to the sea. We call it loss, but what if it is more? What if, in the vast and intricate design of existence, this is not an ending, but a necessary movement, a hand unseen, shifting the threads of your life to weave a story you cannot yet read? God, in his wisdom, does not only bring people into our lives, he also takes them away, not in cruelty, but in purpose, not to leave us empty, but to make space for something greater. And though it may feel like silence, like absence, like a note unresolved in the melody of your days, trust this: the composer has not finished his song. Perhaps what you call separation is actually grace in disguise. Perhaps what feels like an absence is the hand of eternity, gently turning the page. Life is not a series of accidents. It is not a tangled mess of chance encounters and random goodbyes. It is a tapestry woven with precision by the hands of the Almighty. Every thread, every connection, every face you have ever known was placed in your life for a reason. Some to walk with you, some to sharpen you, some to challenge and even break you, and some were never meant to stay. And that is where the ache begins. When someone who once stood beside you, someone who shaped your days, suddenly becomes a memory, it is easy to wonder why. Easy to question the fairness of it all. We hold on tightly, thinking we know best. But have you ever considered that the one who left, whether by choice, by conflict, or by the mysterious movement of life, was never meant to walk your entire journey? God, in his infinite wisdom, orchestrates the relationships of our lives not as we would, but as he knows is best. Some people are assigned to a single chapter, while others are written into the margins of our story for only a moment. And when the time comes for them to go, it is not always a sign of loss, but of divine direction. Think of the seasons. The golden leaves of autumn do not resist the wind. They do not cling to the branches in fear of the winter ahead. They let go because that is the way of things. The tree does not die when its leaves fall. No, it prepares for something new. And yet when we face loss, we fight against it. We cry out, "Why, Lord? Why now? Why this person?" But what if the real question isn't why they left? What if it is why they were there in the first place? Perhaps they came to teach you something. Perhaps they were sent to show you what love is or what love is not. Maybe they were a mirror revealing parts of yourself that you would have never seen on your own. Or maybe, just maybe, their presence in your life was only meant to prepare you for the greater work that God is doing in you. We struggle with this because we forget we are not the authors of our own story. We are not the weavers of the tapestry. We see only a single thread at a time, but God sees the whole design. He sees how one relationship prepares the way for another. He sees how one departure makes space for an arrival. And if he, in his perfect love, allows someone to leave your life, you can trust that it is not to leave you empty, but to make room for something greater. It is painful, yes. The tearing away of something familiar always is. But pain is not the enemy. Pain is often the process by which God moves us from where we are to where we were always meant to be. Look back on your own life. How many times have you been grateful in hindsight for what you once thought was a terrible loss? How many times has an unanswered prayer turned out to be a greater mercy? We serve a God who is too wise to be mistaken and too loving to be unkind. If he removes someone from your life, it is not by accident. It is not without purpose. The hand that gives is the same hand that takes away, and both are acts of love. So do not hold too tightly to what God is trying to release. Do not mourn a season that was only meant to be temporary. Instead, trust. Trust that the one who placed every star in the heavens, who orders the rising and setting of the sun, is also ordering your steps. And if he is the one writing your story, you can be sure no chapter ever ends without reason. We don't like to let go. It's in our nature to hold on, to people, to places, to moments that made us feel alive. We wrap our hands around what is familiar and call it ours, believing that if we grip it tightly enough, we can make it stay. But life does not work that way. God does not work that way. There comes a time when someone who was once a part of your world is suddenly gone. Maybe they walked away. Maybe circumstances pulled them in a different direction. Maybe it was a quiet drifting, so slow you didn't notice it at first, until one day you looked up and realized they were no longer beside you. And it hurts. It leaves a space where something used to be. And in that space, questions rise like echoes. Why did this happen? Did I do something wrong? Was I not enough? But what if instead of asking why they left, we asked, why God allowed it? What if, instead of seeing loss as a punishment, we saw it as preparation? A gardener knows that to make a tree stronger, sometimes he must cut it back. The branches that once reached high into the sky may be pruned, not because they were useless, but because they were no longer helping the tree grow. And if the tree could feel, perhaps it would resist. Perhaps it would cry out against the shears. But the gardener sees what the tree cannot. He knows that without the cutting, there can be no greater flourishing. And so it is with God. When He removes someone from your life, it is not to harm you, but to make way for something new. It is a sacred transition, a divine reordering of your path. We may not understand it in the moment, but trust this. Nothing that belongs to you in God's purpose will ever be taken away, and nothing that is removed was ever meant to stay. Think back on your life. How many times have you looked back at something you thought you needed, someone you thought you couldn't live without, only to realize later that their absence was actually a blessing? How many times has a door that once seemed cruelly closed turned out to be the very thing that led you to where you were always meant to go? We don't see it at first. Loss feels like an emptying, not a filling. It feels like being left behind, not being moved forward. But faith tells us that what we feel is not always what is true. Faith tells us that God's hands are at work, even when all we see is what has been taken away. If you are mourning the loss of someone in your life, I want you to hear this. It is not the end of your story. It is not a sign of your worth. It is not a mistake. God is shifting things, realigning, making space, and if He is taking something away, you can be sure He is also preparing to give. The pain you feel is real, but so is the promise that He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. The promise that nothing is ever truly lost in His hands. The promise that when one chapter ends, so do not mourn what was never meant to stay. Do not fear the empty places. God is not subtracting. He is making room. And when the time is right, He will fill that space with something greater than you ever imagined. There are moments in life when God seems silent, when you pray for answers, but all you hear is the echo of your own voice. And perhaps the hardest silence of all is when someone leaves your life and heaven does not tell you why. We don't do well with silence. We want explanations. We want closure. We want to understand why someone who once mattered so deeply is no longer here. We think if God would just speak, just give us one clear reason, then maybe the ache would be easier to bear. But what if the silence itself is His answer? There is a mystery in the way God moves. We often expect Him to work in grand displays, in parting seas and burning bushes, but more often than not, He moves quietly. When Elijah stood on the mountain waiting for God, a mighty wind tore through the rocks, but God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. Then a fire, but God was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a still, small voice. God speaks in whispers. And sometimes His greatest work is done not in the noise, but in the quiet. You see, when someone is removed from your life, it leaves a silence behind, a space where laughter used to be, a space where conversations once filled the air. And in that silence, you have a choice. You can fill it with bitterness, with regret, with the endless noise of asking why, or you can listen. You can lean into the quiet and trust that even though God is not explaining, he is still working. Think about Jesus on the cross. In his final moments, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In that moment, even the Son of God felt the weight of divine silence. But was God absent? No, heaven was not ignoring him. Heaven was accomplishing something greater than the world had ever seen. The same is true in your life. When someone leaves and all you hear is silence, do not mistake it for abandonment. Do not mistake it for punishment. What if, instead of God taking something away, he is making space for something new? What if, instead of withholding answers, he is drawing you closer to the sound of his still, small voice? Look at the night sky. The stars are brilliant. The moon lights the earth, but behind it all is a vast and infinite silence. And yet, is that silence empty? No, it holds the mysteries of the universe. It holds the fingerprints of the one who spoke all things into being. And just as the silence of space is filled with his presence, so is the silence in your life. If someone has left you and heaven seems quiet, do not be afraid. God is not ignoring you. He is inviting you to trust when there are no answers, inviting you to believe when the reason is still unseen, inviting you to rest in the assurance that he is never absent, never idle, never unaware. And when the time is right, when you have walked through the silence and learned to listen, you will see God was speaking all along. Nothing in this life is truly ours to hold, not people, not moments, not even time itself. We like to believe that we can keep things just as they are, that the people we love will always remain, that the chapters we cherish will never close. But life moves, and with it, everything in our world shifts, sometimes slowly, sometimes in an instant. It is one of the hardest lessons we must learn, that people come and go. Friendships fade, loved ones depart, relationships change, and no matter how much we fight to keep things the same, we cannot stop the tide from rising and falling. We cannot make the river of life stand still. When someone leaves your life, it is natural to resist, to hold on, to reach back, to try and force something that is no longer meant to be. But what if the very act of letting go is what allows you to move forward? What if, in trying to cling to what was, you are missing what is meant to be? Think of a child at the ocean's edge, grasping at the waves, trying to hold the water in their hands. No matter how tightly they squeeze, the water slips through their fingers. It was never meant to be held, it was meant to move. And so it is with life. People are not possessions. Relationships are not chains. The flow of life is sacred, designed by the hand of God himself. And just as he brings people into our lives, he also, in his perfect wisdom, allows some to leave. We don't always understand it, we don't always like it, but faith is trusting that when something is removed, it is not by accident. That when a door closes, it is not without purpose. That when someone steps away, it is not the end of your story, it is simply a change in the rhythm of the journey. Think of Abraham, called by God to leave his homeland, his people, everything from he had no roadmap, no clear destination, only the voice of God telling him to go. What if he had refused? What if he had clung to what was comfortable, what was known? He would have missed the promise. He would have missed the greater purpose waiting for him. And maybe that is where you are right now, standing in the tension between what was and what will be, watching someone drift away, feeling the pull of the past, afraid of what the future holds. But hear this, you were not meant to live in yesterday. You were not meant to cling to something that God in his love is asking you to release. There is freedom in surrender. There is peace in trusting that the same God who orchestrates the stars, who commands the seas, who holds the entire universe together, is also holding your life. And if he is allowing a separation, it is not to harm you, but to guide you. It is not to leave you empty, but to make room for what comes next. So do not fight the current. Do not hold so tightly to what was that you miss what is being prepared for you. Trust that the one who began your story is still writing it. Trust that nothing is lost in his hands. And when the time comes to release, do so with faith, because life is not meant to be held, it is meant to move. Pain has a way of making us question everything. When someone is removed from our life, when a relationship ends, when someone we love drifts away, the ache can feel unbearable. It is in these moments that we ask, why, God? Why this? Why now? Why did you take them away? But what if we are asking the wrong question? What if instead of why is this happening to me, we ask, what is this preparing me for? Nothing in God's hands is wasted. No tear, no loss, no separation is meaningless. We see only the moment, the wound, the emptiness left behind. But God sees the whole picture. He sees what is being shaped, refined, and prepared within us. And sometimes the very thing that feels like it is breaking us is actually making us into who we were always meant to be. Think about gold. Before it shines, before it becomes something of great worth, it must pass through the fire. The heat must rise. The impurities must be burned away. It is not an easy process, but it is a necessary one. Without the fire, the gold remains unrefined. Without the fire, it never reaches its full value, and so it is with us. God allows us to walk through seasons of pain, not to destroy us, but to purify us, to strip away the things that do not belong, to strengthen the parts of us that were weak, to prepare us for a greater calling, a greater purpose, a greater blessing than we ever imagined. Joseph, the son of Jacob, knew this kind of pain. Betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, imprisoned. At every turn, it seemed like God was stripping something away. It must have felt like loss. It must have felt like punishment. But in reality, it was preparation. Every trial, every injustice, every long and lonely night was shaping him into the man who would one day stand before Pharaoh and save an entire nation. What his brothers meant for evil, God meant for good. And the same is true in your life. You may not understand it now. You may not see how this loss, this separation, this moment of pain could ever be used for good. But trust this. God is not done with you. He is refining you. He is removing what no longer serves your destiny. He is strengthening the parts of you that will carry his purpose forward. Do not mistake the fire for abandonment. Do not mistake the pain for punishment. It is in the breaking that God does his greatest work. It is in the struggle that he shapes you for what is coming next. And when you come out on the other side, you will see you were never losing, you were becoming. So if you are walking through the fire, if you are feeling the weight of loss, take heart. You are being refined. You are being strengthened. You are being prepared for something far greater than you can imagine. And when the time comes, you will stand in the light of his purpose and realize every moment of pain was worth it. We spend so much of our lives trying to understand what God is doing. When something is given to us, we rejoice. When something is taken away, we grieve. We wrestle with the unknown, trying to piece together a picture that makes sense. But faith was never about seeing the full picture. Faith is about trusting the one who holds it. There will be moments in your life when God removes someone, and you will not understand why. You may never receive the answers you long for. You may never know why a friendship faded, why a relationship ended, why someone who was once so close became a stranger. And that uncertainty can feel unbearable. It can make you question whether you did something wrong, whether you should have fought harder, whether things could have been different. But hear me, God does not call you to understand. He calls you to trust. Imagine standing before a great tapestry woven with 1,000 threads of different colors. Up close, all you see are loose ends, tangled knots, patterns that seem broken and unfinished. But if you could step back, if you could see it from the perspective of the one who weaves it, you would see that every thread has a purpose. Every color, every crossing, every space where one thread ends and another begins is part of a masterpiece far greater than you could have imagined. Your life is that tapestry, and God is the master weaver. If he has removed someone from your life, trust that it was not an accident. If he has allowed a door to close, trust that it was not a mistake. What looks like loss to you is divine design to him. He sees what you cannot see. He knows what you do not know. And in his wisdom, he is shaping your story into something beautiful. Think about the disciples on the road to Emmaus. After Jesus had been crucified, they walked with heavy hearts, confused and discouraged. The one they had followed was gone. The future they had envisioned was shattered. And as they journeyed, a man joined them, walking beside them, speaking truth into their sorrow. They did not recognize him at first. They did not realize that the very one they were grieving was standing right there beside them. How often do we do the same? How often do we focus so much on what is missing that we fail to see the presence of God right beside us? How often do we dwell on the absence of someone, not realizing that their departure is making room for something greater? God's ways are not our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and while we may not always understand, we can always trust. Trust that he is leading you. Trust that he is guiding you towards something better. Trust that even in the moments of loss, he is working all things together for good. One day you will look back and it will all make sense. One day you will see how every goodbye, every separation, every closed door was part of a greater plan. And in that moment you will thank him, not just for what he gave, but for what he took away. So do not be afraid. Do not hold on to what he is asking you to release. The one who holds your life has never made a mistake, and he never will.